Well, hello, and welcome to Sunday Morning with Hope Valley. My name is Sam. I am the lead pastor here at Hope Valley House Churches, and today we are continuing in our study through 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We've been going through every chapter and verse in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but we've been going out of order because we're tackling one topic at a time. We've talked about being in Christ alone. We've talked about living by the Spirit. We've talked about becoming mature and being in church relationship. And now we're in the 5th and final topic in our study through 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and that's the topic of leadership. Okay, and in the last lesson, we began to talk about leadership and the fact that all of us really are given some measure of leadership and authority in life, and God gives us authority and influence so that we can benefit others. Any authority and influence that God gives us, He gives us so we can benefit others, not so that we can serve our own interests. And so in today's lesson, we're going to see that the real test of godly leadership is how closely it resembles the example that is set by Jesus, right? In 2 Corinthians 11, that's the chapter we're going to be in today, we're going to see Paul further prove that the so-called super apostles that were taking advantage of the Corinthians, and they were taking advantage of the Corinthians' wealth, they were actually false apostles, and the way that they could know that was because the character of these people looked nothing like the conduct of Jesus, right? And so we also want to note, before we get into this chapter, it's going to get a little spicy, okay? Paul has already been kind of sarcastic and outright sarcastic several times, as we've seen in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. He would sometimes use sarcasm to kind of jolt people into grabbing their attention and seeing the ridiculousness of some of the things that they were allowing and believing. But in today's passage, we're going to see him using a lot of sarcasm to emphasize his point and to shock the Corinthians into seeing just how ridiculous their attitude and their approach had become. And so keep that in mind, because you're going to see a lot of that. It's going to get spicy today. So we're in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm going to go ahead and read this chapter, and then we're going to break it down together. All right? So 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1 says, I wish you would put up with me, I wish you would put up with a little foolishness from me. Yes, do put up with me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, because I've promised you in marriage to one husband, to present a pure virgin to Christ. But I fear that as the serpent deceived Eve by his cunning, your minds may be seduced from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ. For if a person comes and preaches another Jesus whom we did not preach, or you receive a different spirit which you had not received, or a different gospel which you had not accepted, you put up with it splendidly. Now I consider myself in no way inferior to those super apostles. Even if I am untrained in public speaking, I am certainly not untrained in knowledge. Indeed, we have in every way made that clear to you in everything. Or did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you might be exalted, because I preached the gospel of God to you free of charge? I robbed other churches by taking pay from them to minister to you. When I was present with you and in need, I did not burden anyone, since the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my needs. I have kept myself and will keep myself from burdening you in any way. As the truth of Christ is in me, this boasting of mine will not be stopped in the regions of Achaia. Why? Because I don't love you? God knows I do. But I will continue to do whatever I am doing in order to deny an opportunity to those who want to be regarded as our equals in what they boast about. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is no great surprise if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness. Their end will be according to their works. I repeat, Let no one consider me a fool, but if you do, at least accept me as a fool so that I can go on and boast a little. What I'm saying in this matter of boasting, I don't speak as the Lord would, but as it were, foolishly. Since many boast according to the flesh, I also will boast. For you, being so wise, gladly put up with fools. In fact, you put up with it if someone enslaves you, if someone exploits you, if someone takes advantage of you, if someone is arrogant toward you, if someone slaps you in the face. I say this to our shame. We have been too weak for that. But in whatever anyone dares to boast, I am talking foolishly. I also dare. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they descendants of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I'm a better one. With far more labors, many more imprisonments, far worse beatings, many times near death. 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1 from the Jews. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I have spent a night and a day in the open sea. On frequent journeys, I faced dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my own people, dangers from Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea, and dangers among false brothers. Toil and hardship, many sleepless nights, hunger and thirst, often without food, cold and without clothing, and not to mention other things, there is the daily pressure on me, my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble, and I do not burn with indignation? If boasting is necessary, I will boast about my weaknesses. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus, who is blessed forever, knows I am not lying. In Damascus, a ruler under King Aretas guarded the city of Damascus in order to arrest me, so I had to be let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. All right, a lot of passion there in what Paul is writing. I think you can understand why. You can hear deep within that his love for these people and his plea for them to come to their senses, right, and to not put up with these false leaders anymore. But we're going to look today at how we can recognize a godly leader by how closely their conduct and their character matches the example of Jesus, right? First major point in this chapter is that a godly leader lowers themselves to lift up others. Right? We saw that in verse 6 through 9 and 12 through 13, right? He said, even if I'm untrained in public speaking, I'm not untrained in knowledge, did I commit a sin by humbling myself so that you would be exalted, right? The proof that some other apostles were false, ungodly leaders was that they elevated themselves at the expense of the people they were claiming to lead, right? And again, we saw that in verse 20 and 21. When a leader elevates themselves and seeks their own glory, this is one of the clearest red flags that they are not following Christ. Because look at John chapter 8, verse 50. Jesus said this. He said, I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it and judges, right? And so Jesus didn't even seek his own glory, but the glory of the Father. And so any leader who elevates themselves and seeks their own glory is one of the clearest red flags that leader is not following Christ. And that's what Paul is calling out, right? Unlike those so-called super apostles, right? And we see that in verse 5, he calls them that. Paul proved himself to be a godly leader by following Jesus' example of prioritizing the needs and the interests of others. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus said, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many, right? Lowering oneself is not just an occasional action that you do for show. Lowering yourself the way that Jesus lowered himself to serve and to lead is actually a whole way of living, and it's a whole way of thinking about what really matters, right? And so a godly leader lowers themselves to lift up others. This is one of the ways we recognize a godly leader. Second major point we see here in this chapter is that a godly leader willingly sacrifices for the people they lead, right? We saw this again in verse 23. He said, are they servants of Christ? And I love how he as you're going through this chapter, Paul has these kind of parenthetical notes. As he's going on and going, fine, you want to be foolish? You want to brag? Fine, I'll go ahead and brag too, just to make the point. And as he's bragging, he'll pause and he'll go, can you hear how crazy this sounds, right? He's like, are they servants of Christ? Parenthetical note, I'm talking like a madman. And he's like, I'm a better one. Fine, let's go for it, right? If you want to brag, let's brag, right? So anyway, it's a fun thing that Paul is doing there that kind of makes me chuckle, right? But he says, far more imprisonments, far worse beatings, many times no death. And then look at this in verse 28. He says, not to mention all that suffering, but there's the daily pressure on me. Some translations translate the original Greek there to say, Paul says, there's a daily anxiety that I bear for all the churches, right? So Paul feels the weight and the concern for the churches. He said, who is weak and I'm not weak? Who is made to stumble? And I don't burn with indignation. In other words, he's saying that he's closely tied and empathetic to the people that he is leading, right? Not only was Paul willing to continue in ministry no matter how much he suffered, right? But his heart also stayed closely tied and deeply empathetic with the people that he's leading. That's what he means when he says, who is weak and I'm not weak, right? He's like, if you're suffering, I feel it. If someone hurts you, I'm enraged by that, right? It bothers me. I carry the weight and the concern for you, right? This demonstrated what he was willing to suffer and sacrifice for their sake, which again is following the example of Jesus, right? 1 Peter 2 verse 21 says, for you were called to this because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his footsteps, right? So Christ suffered for us, and as leaders, we suffer willingly and sacrifice willingly for the people that God has called us to lead, in whatever capacity that looks like, right? The false apostles that were working their way into the Corinthian church, right? They're commending themselves on their speaking skill and on their charisma, rather than their willingness to join in the suffering of Jesus, right? Go look at what Paul said in Colossians chapter 1, verse 24, right? And so this is another way that Paul said, hey, Corinthians, here's how you know these super apostles are actually false apostles. They're not willing to suffer like Jesus did, and they're not commending themselves by how much of their behavior and conduct looks like Jesus. They're commending themselves by these worldly measures, right? They're really good public speakers. They're so articulate and they can turn a phrase and an argument so well in the public square, but they don't have the character. They don't have the conduct. They don't have the heart of Christ. And this is how you know that they're false apostles, right? A common error is to think of leadership as something that elevates you above the mess and exempts you from certain things, right? Like a leader might say, oh, I don't get involved with that. I'm beyond that now. And they might not say it that crassly because they know how bad it sounds, but they will act that way and they'll think that way, right? That if I'm leading, then it rises me above the peasants. I don't go clean toilets in the church. I'm too good for that now. I'm a leader, right? But to lead as Christ did means to voluntarily take on greater difficulty and greater suffering, right? So being a leader doesn't exempt you from things or rise you above the mess. It actually puts you down into the mess. Okay, that's where Jesus is. And that's where his disciples were, right? And so we want to think about all those things. So again, my second major point here is that a godly leader willingly sacrifices and suffers for the people that they lead. And the third and final major point in this chapter is that a godly leader is honest and doesn't create a false appearance, right? In verse 30, at the end of this chapter, he said, if boasting is necessary, then I will boast about my weaknesses. Paul was essentially saying that if they wanted him to compete with the false apostles, like in some kind of a bragging contest, then the only thing he would brag about was that he had nothing to brag about. He's like, fine, you want me to do that? You want me to defend how great I am? I'm actually just going to tell you how not great I am. right? Because a godly leader is honest and doesn't create a false appearance, not trying to get you to fall in love with them. They're trying to get you to fall in love with Jesus, right? Anything good in Paul was only there because of Christ. Go look at what Paul wrote in Galatians 2:20, right? And so Jesus should get all the attention, not Paul. That's what Paul's saying. And then if you go back to the beginning of the chapter in verse 2 and 3, he said, this is what Paul wrote to me. He said, look, I'm jealous for you with a godly jealousy because I have promised you in marriage to one husband to present you like a pure virgin to Christ, right? He's like, but I fear that as the serpent deceived Eve in his cunning, your minds will be seduced away from a sincere and pure devotion to Christ, right? And so another reason that honesty and transparency is the mark of a godly leader is because it shows that they value the truth, right? Go look at 1 John chapter 1, 5 and 6, right? It shows that they value the truth and that they aren't trying to get you to see perfection in them. Rather, they're trying to get you to see the perfection that is in Jesus. And that's really, he starts chapter 11 with that. In verse 2 and 3, he's like, listen, I'm jealous for you. I'm trying to keep you not devoted to Paul, not devoted to these other leaders. I'm trying to keep you devoted to Christ. And I'm worried that these false super apostles, they're teaching you to be devoted to them and not be devoted to Jesus. And I just want your focus on him. And so Paul, therefore, is not trying to build up his own brand or his own image, right? He's just honest about everything he's been through and everything he's struggling through with them, because he's like, I don't want you to follow me. I want you to follow Christ. That's why I'm reaching out to you. And by the way, that's another way that you know that I'm actually the leader that God has sent you, because the leader that God has sent you would lead you to Jesus, not lead you to themselves, right? And so honesty and transparency is the mark of a godly leader because it shows that they value the truth, and they're not trying to get you to see perfection in them. They're trying to get you to see perfection in Jesus, right? So we want to think about it today. I got some questions for us to discuss and think about. Before I do that, as always, we want to pause now. Let's go ahead and pray. If you're listening to this, if you're watching this, now is a good time to pause and pray. We're going to ask the Holy Spirit that he would show us what he wants us to see and understand and apply in our lives today. So let's take that pause. And then I've got some questions for you to go a little bit deeper. All right. All right, so as always, I've got these questions that are going to help you go a little bit deeper. If you are in a group setting, again, now's a great time to pause and discuss these questions together. If you're by yourself, go ahead and write these questions down, pray about them, think about them, journal, that kind of thing, and just go a little bit deeper in that way. Here's the first question. What other Jesus or different gospel, think of verse 4, might the false apostles have been preaching? Okay, that's a good question, I think. I know I'm asking it, right? But so he says, if somebody preaches another Jesus or another gospel, let's theorize for a minute. What kinds of other Jesuses or other gospels might these false apostles have been kind of sneakily teaching the Corinthian church? I think that we could assume some of that based off of what we see taught today. So let's try to identify those things. Second question, how does Paul's deep empathy, look at verse 29, show he was a godly leader, right? Let's dig into that a little bit deeper. I know I've talked about it, but let's dig into that a little bit deeper. And then the third question is, why is honesty about our own flaws essential for pointing people to a perfect Christ? Okay, let's think about that question and discuss that together. Why is honesty about our own flaws essential for pointing people to a perfect Christ? Okay, and how can we actually work against people seeing a perfect Christ when we're too concerned with them seeing perfection in us, or just avoiding them seeing any of the flaws in us, right? So let's think about today. Then my exhortation for you this week, very straightforward. I want you to examine the people you follow and why you follow them in light of 2 Corinthians 11. Look, this sermon is on podcast and YouTube, right? And I know that there are many other sermons available on TV and podcasts, YouTube, all these things. And you're following people, I'm sure, and you're listening to sermons outside of your local congregation. I think that's great. That's fine. But we do want to pay attention. Why am I following this person? Why do I see them as a leader in the church? Right? In light of what we're looking at here in 2 Corinthians 11, if I'm following a leader, I want you to rethink that leader, and I want you to rethink why you're following them. It's just something that honestly we don't ask ourselves enough. We can be like the Corinthians. We can see someone who's charismatic and a really good speaker, and we gravitate to them, and we soak up everything they say. And maybe we're not pausing and going, what is actually attracting me to this leader? Why am I following them? Why am I listening to them? In light of 2 Corinthians 11, am I seeing the things that the Scripture is teaching me I should see, or am I seeing the things that my cultural inclination just caused me to like and follow? Right? So that's my exhortation for you this week. Examine the people you follow and why you follow them in light of 2 Corinthians 11. I hope this has been helpful for you. We've got a couple of lessons left in this series, and they're going to be wrapped up entirely. So I hope that you'll continue with us as we finish up our time in 1 and 2 Corinthians. In the meantime, I pray the Lord would bless you and that His Spirit would work in you to shape you into the image of Jesus. In the meantime, thanks again for being with us, and pray the Lord will bless you. All right. Be blessed. Have a good day.